For 4 weeks, we are focusing on a few facts. And I think these are uncontroversial and kind of obvious. Fact number 1, some Christians believe some weird things and do some weird things and behave in really weird ways. Number 2, that weirdness has been and is pushing people away from church. But number 3, the holy foundation of our tradition is not nearly as weird as some of the people who follow it. So, number 4, there might actually be good and healthy ways to understand and experience and follow this thing we call faith. Even if you, in your whole life, you think, I am so done with church, even if you grew up and you have this baggage about what some of this stuff means, there may be ways of peeling back the layers of odd, bizarre things that Christians do and opening yourself up to a new life without excluding people, without excluding your own reason, with a sense of spiritual sacredness, and with a perspective of humility and beauty with a group of messy people like you. And that's what we're up to. By now, most of you are familiar with the sarcastic definition of Christianity that we've been using as our foil. This is the weird way that faith comes across to many people. Christianity is the belief that a cosmic Jewish zombie who was his own father can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him you accept him as your master so that he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. Yeah, right. And so far we challenge the idea that faith is a belief that, not an intellectual decision, but maybe it's more of an emotional, trusting, believing in, or even better than believe, we can be love. And last week we challenged the idea that faith is about if you do something, then God has to respond, but maybe it's more about us responding to the grace and wonder that is ever present in the universe. This week, what's the point of all this? What's the so that? Why do we do this? What do we get out of it? Do people come to church and rethink their worldview and change their behaviors and sacrifice their time and their money and figure out what's too weird and what's worthwhile so that God can remove an evil force from your soul? Do we do this so that we can get out of trouble? Trouble here and trouble forever? Trouble that we cause and trouble that isn't even our fault because it's just present in the world and in our soul waiting to come out sometime? Is that what we're doing here? Just fire insurance? Worship and devotion so that, that was a close call. I was believing things almost right and I was acting pretty goody two-shoes, but eventually I crossed some threshold, so God had to back off. Is that what we're doing here? The last 2 weeks have been very heady, very theoretical, very theological. We're going to be more emotional today. If faith has a connection to emotion, we're going to try to reach toward that today. We're going to get mad and we're going to get sad, even if that gets heavy. It will trigger some hard feelings, and for some of you, there will be turbulence in this sermon, but I promise through the turbulence, we will land on good news. I promise this sermon is aiming for a more graceful answer for what we're doing here. See, some things make you mad and some things make you sad. What might make one person forlorn will make another person furious. The thing that makes me the most angry in the world, and also brings out the most anguish, is when someone abuses a child. It breaks my heart when a child is abused. Do you agree? Yes. And it makes me want to break the abuser. Which maybe you don't expect your pastor to say, and if you disagree with that, you can pray for me. But that's how I feel sometimes when I come across a child who is taken advantage of, and I come across that a lot. I have to bury this fury and remember what I'm truly fighting for. There was a time, not so long ago, but I had 2 arms. And there was a time a little bit before that they were pretty darn strong arms. None of you knew me then, but when I was about 26, 27 years old, I was training for the Olympics, and I was a pretty tough kid. A little smaller than I am now, but a lot of strength and way too much confidence of youth. Confidence of youth can get you in trouble. So when I say there were times when I wanted to break someone, there were times when there were a lot of people I could have broken. And once I did confront a father. And I won't tell you the details because I can't tell you the details because they're all locked up in those court thingies. But you know enough about what drunk and weak men will do to little boys. And when I confronted him, I did it with a surprising calm I didn't really expect. It took a lot of work to do that. I did not raise my voice even after he yelled. I did not respond when he pushed his finger in my chest. Have you ever had someone push their finger in your chest? I did not shrink away when he threatened to, quote, hunt me down with a gun. 2 days later, on camp, we had a report of a gunman. My anger and my strength and my resolve and indignation, it melted right through my veins. Probably should have peed my pants. I don't know why I didn't. Turned out that gunman wasn't that man, but it definitely made me wonder, had I done the right thing? Had I picked the right fight? Had I bitten off more than I can chew? Had I let my emotions get me into a situation that I couldn't handle? Should I have just left that alone and let someone else deal with it? But I decided this was somehow a fight for me. I'm not going to fight that guy, but I do believe this is precisely the kind of injustice that I am called in my career in life to fight against. I can't do much for that boy after it happened, but this is an issue that we all face to help boys before it happens. Does that make sense? Some of you would want to hold on to that boy and comfort him. Others of you want to punch that dad. But maybe we agree that there's some other third way that we can address the injustice on a larger spectrum. The thing that makes me second most angry, that also draws up the second most anguish in me, is when someone abuses a woman. I have a lifetime of being around men who do pretty much whatever they want. Throughout even my adult life, just about wherever I have lived, women have come to me to talk about what happened, maybe in the midst of danger, just to talk about safety. And every time, it breaks my heart, and it makes me want to break somebody else. In college, for 1 year, I lived in graduate school. For 1 year, I lived in an apartment complex. There were about 50 units of 2-bedroom houses. And in that 50-unit apartment complex, the manager, he was a little younger than I am now, but he'd been a boxer when he was young. His wife was pregnant. They were really a great couple. Everything about him seemed fantastic. But one night, she ran from her first floor apartment across the parking lot, up the stairs to mine, knock on the door. She had not been hit yet, but she was scared, and so I drove her to her parents. That was just a few miles away. The whole time she's apologizing. Why did she need to apologize? She was a victim. She was apologizing. I felt sorry for her, and she was the one. I'm sorry. And the next day, as I come back, of course, I have to stare into the eyes of the manager, the husband. I went from anguish to anger, but what should I do? Should I have stayed out of it? He didn't even do anything. Why did I get mixed up in it? Why risk an actual fight that I would lose for this? It actually worked out well. And that husband, even in one of the more emotional conversations I've ever had with a man, thanked me for taking his wife out of that situation. And he went to counseling, and they stayed married, and I don't know what happened to him. That's a long time ago. Eventually I moved away. But before I moved away, in the same apartment complex, just a few months later, there was another woman who, this woman was cute and single. And so all the single guys in the apartment complex had been doing all they could to gain her attention. But eventually she got back with her boyfriend who drove a red Camaro. Not to make stereotypes. But old red Camaro always had a lot of cash, and he made it pretty clear he was a bad dude. So all the single guys backed off. Sometimes she told me things without telling me things, because that's what you do when you're 22 and stuck. How do you release someone who is captive in that situation? I was powerless. I was full of pity. But one day she couldn't tell me anything anymore. She just ran to my door, face swollen, broken jaw, couldn't say anything, and I was just incensed. I barely had time for my own anguish, because a minute later, he shows up in my doorway, more anger than I had. And I talked my way out of it because I've talked my way out of a whole bunch of things in my life. And I convinced him, let her just sleep it off here a bit. And she did. She slept it off on my couch for a while, and my plan was to take her to the hospital first chance I could. But an hour, 2 hours later, he shows up again, demanding that she come with him. And he insinuates a little something about something. And he says, well, she just fell on the concrete. There's not going to be any police report, of course. So what do I do? What can I do? This isn't my fight. How could I help her without getting myself in a real jam? So I let her go. Best I could do is I asked my mother to write her a letter, survivor to survivor. I don't know what happened to that woman either. One apartment complex, and there were 2 stories, and yet there was one more woman. The manager's wife was to the left, the woman who was beaten was ahead, and to the bottom right was a woman that I had kind of grown up with. See, when we were in 8th grade, her father, who actually sold my family our house, her father did more than break a jaw. He killed his wife when his daughter was in 8th grade. And I remember being in 8th grade, and the school was on lockdown when he came to get her. My friend, she was to spend the next 8 years of her life, high school and college, wishing there had been someone to stand up to that abuse. Probably wishing someone was standing and supporting her through it all. Definitely hoping that someone is going to be there to stand with the next woman in trouble. And that third way, to stand with the next person in trouble, that's all I can do. That's the only fight I have. The third thing that makes me most angry, alongside the most anguish, is when some pastor in your past has spiritually abused you. What does that mean? How can that be so dramatic as these other things? How can I leap to that? Let me explain that. One of the most meaningful parts of being a pastor is being able to take part in a good death. Being there when a family comes together, when a person accepts their fate and faces it with honor, and when the dying person teaches all those around about forgiveness and strength, and when together we can plan a great celebration. It is so affirming when someone can be a light in the midst of their darkness. But it doesn't always happen that way, does it? Sometimes I have to push my anger under my anguish when someone facing their impending mortality is terrified of what comes next because of some weird and abusive religious oppression. See, if some ideas about life and death and God and sin get mixed up, when that happens, far too often people refuse to accept their death. They refuse to prepare for it. They won't allow themselves to be loved, and they can live their last days in dread, absolute existential dread at judgment coming after they die. I'm not talking about the fear of not living anymore. That can happen to anyone. I'm not talking about the grief of leaving people that you love. We all have to deal with that. I'm not talking about the struggle to make amends. Those feelings will bubble up for most of us. What I'm talking about is that some churches and some pastors, probably ages ago, filled people with such a weird fear of a loving God, a fear of having to pay for their sins when the Bible story says they had been paid for. Fills them with a fear of, will God remove that evil force from my soul or just punish me forever? The amount of pain caused by that kind of religious oppression doesn't get the headlines like the others. And there are fewer stories of strong survivors, but I promise you from my experience sitting at bedsides, it is spiritual abuse to sell a worldview that leads to unconquerable guilt and fear. And it breaks my heart, and frankly, I just want to break the system that has led to that religious trash. And I'm not talking about just some crazy fundamentalists out there. I meet people who have spent their whole adult lives in churches learning about unconditional love from great pastors with nearly heretical ideas about heaven. Those people are nearly as likely to be crippled by these childhood bogey tales about whether they are good enough for a good God. I've met people who haven't gone to church in 50 years. People who have lived with secular values and with no time for religion and myths, but somehow, so deep down, someone planted these terrible ideas about judgment, some terrible ideas about what is essentially wrong with you. This terrible idea that they have to pay for something that isn't even their fault, and they are terrified. So I feel sympathy. Sometimes I try to teach a better theology on the doors of death. I try to explain grace in the Bible, and I try to explain that the word hell only shows up 12 or 13 times in the New Testament, and almost all of them are Jesus warning religious leaders like me about pushing you in the wrong direction. Jesus never, ever uses that concept as a threat against people like you. But theology doesn't work. So while I try to comfort someone, maybe I'll comfort you someday, I also have to push down this pulsing anger at whatever happened in your past that locked you in a prison of pain and stole the peace of your passing. And so all I can do is try to preach good news now with more passion to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person. Because all across the country, so many churches are so concerned about sin and shame and Satan and scaring people toward faith, which produces crappy faith based on the fear of getting something wrong. And it produces life-crippling guilt that blinds people towards joy in so many things. I don't understand why 50 or 60 years on, people hold on to these messages of bad news from callous and ignorant, power-driven people who think that God is some cigar-chomping loan shark. I don't know why people give up so much of this weird stuff about Christianity, but for some reason they hold on to this broken idea about the economy of sin. Did you pay enough to wash it away? As though it wasn't already paid for. I want to be peaceful, but this other part of me just can't stand to see the suffering of abuse. I'm not going to go find some 80-year-old retired pastor and beat them up. Although I dream about being in a worship service sometime and hearing some guy talk about all this stuff and me just standing up with my Samuel L. Jackson and saying, "Allow me to retort." But the point is I am not going to fight a child abuser, but I will fight child abuse. I am not going to fight a domestic abuser, but I will fight domestic abuse. I will not fight some old preacher, but I have decided that part of my calling is to fight against the bad ideas and the bad representations of faith and the bad images of freedom and love and life. Whatever else this series can do for us, even if it's just a reminder of what you already feel, even if it's a little window into a new way of thinking, even if this cracks open a whole new way of understanding community and grace, whatever else this series and today's message can do, my deep hope is that it has ripples far down the line. My deep hope is that we can rid the Christian tradition of these weird, tyrannical, unholy, unbiblical notions of a sin-obsessed God that make it so impossible to earn love. My deep hope is that we understand the love that Jesus reflected so that you can face the full measure of your life with confidence in a world obsessed with grace. It is an amazing thing that the universe is shaped so that we have unique access to goodness. There are bad things that happen to us. There are bad things that we do. And all through life, we suffer the consequences of that simple fact of life, that there's badness. But the essential hope of our life is not, nor should it be, escaping from some original sin. The essential hope of our life is about harnessing our original goodness. God created and declared it good. God created man and woman in the image of God. What room is it there for "are you good enough" for God to keep loving? Whatever is good about this world we live in, however you describe that, we have these metaphors for goodness, perhaps love. And there's one question for how the world is essentially good and loving and how we overcome evil with justice and beauty. It's another question for why the world is like that. And for whatever reason you might have for why this is a good world, another metaphor might be God. So without any of the baggage that we all come with the ideas of God, let's think about the love of God in that context. It does not mean, did you work hard enough to not sin and to do good enough to balance out the sins that you did do so that some actuary in the sky does the math and determines that you pass. The love of God means, at least to me, as I have walked this journey, is that our world is filled with the awe that we can actually love each other and experience joy and beauty. We are called to trust and respond to the hope that we live in a world infused with the wonder of being able to love each other. And what does Paul say about that love of God? Nothing can separate us from that, because it is infused through our very being. If you are part of this fabric of love life, nothing can separate you. Not the powerful things on earth, not the powerful values that move us, not the whole world, not even death. Nothing can separate us. And if this world is made with threads of love like that, then even if there are tears and tears in the fabric, if the whole universe is made of love, how weird to think that we can somehow flip that switch and turn it off when we die. How weird, even evil, I would say, to think that it might be better to rip out some imperfect piece of the world and maybe you because you didn't live up to some magical bar. How weird and evil to think that the whole of you is so loved for 80 years and then just thrown into God's burn pile. How weird to twist the good news of a good God, the good news that Jesus tells and lives and even dies to show us the hope of God's love. How weird and evil to twist that into just one more way of splitting an us and a them, a good and a bad. That is spiritual abuse, and I don't want to put up with it without a fight. Friends, let us not measure our faith on how well we run away from anything, but how completely we run toward beauty. Let us not worry about the rules we break, but let us move to heal all that is broken. Let us not fixate on our weakness, but celebrate the great things we are called to be and to do. Why do we have faith? Not so that we can convince God that we don't deserve torment. Why do we have faith? We walk this journey so that we might live the best life and make the best world we can. Why do we have faith? We follow the footsteps of holy men and women in the Christian tradition so that we can share the good news, so that we can proclaim release to the captives, so that we can give sight to those blinded by broken ideas, so that we can set the oppressed free, so that we can proclaim the Lord's favor for all of us, for you. And may it be so. Amen.